Torah and Science Part 4. The topic for tonight is, did Chazal have complete scientific knowledge? Did they know everything there is to know about science? Now, this question is not a new question. This question has been the source of tremendous controversy from what I'm given to understand, even within the Toronto Jewish community, shocking as that may sound. The issue revolved about maybe 6-7 years ago regarding the ban of some books that had tried to demonstrate some way of reconciling Torah and science, and in the course of doing so, suggesting that perhaps Chazal did not have a perfect knowledge in all areas of wisdom, but rather their knowledge or their wisdom was limited to areas of Torah and how Jews are supposed to govern their lives. Now, this was met with tremendous, like I said, tremendous controversy, because there is an entire school of thought that considers this to be somewhat heretical, to even to suggest that our great Talmudic sages would have had any limitation on their advanced knowledge. If they knew the secrets of the universe through their divine inspiration, then how could they not know the deepest secrets of science? This question really is divided into two parts. Number one, on a theoretical level, is it acceptable to say that our sages made certain assumptions about the world around them based upon what was known to man at that time? And therefore, if we find statements made by our sages in the ancient Talmud that seem to contradict science, we should not be shaken by that, but rather accept the fact that their limitations were based upon the era in which they lived. That's question number one. And question number two is perhaps a more difficult question to answer, which is, if the answer to question one is that indeed Chazal did not have a perfect knowledge of science, how would we deal with halachic issues that are based on bad science? If Chazal make a pronouncement that has halachic repercussions, and we'll see an example of that tonight as well, then how do we deal with the halacha once we discover that the premise of the halacha is bad science, and now that we know that the scientific reality has changed, does the halacha change as well? It's a much more difficult question to deal with. I'm thinking that we may only have time to deal with the first question tonight, but we'll see how far we get. Now again, this is controversial, and there are so many people who shy away from this topic for the simple reason that it's too touchy. They don't want to be labeled as a heretic. So I want to share with you, just go to the back of your packet and source number 9. Rabbi Aryeh Carmel, who we will also be referencing in this topic regarding something that Rabbi Dessler said. Rabbi Aryeh Carmel, Zichrono Livracha, was a great rabbi who passed away just a few years ago, and he was the key disciple of Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, the author of Michtav Me'Eliyahu, one of the founders of the Lakewood, the Gateshead Yeshiva and Kollel in post-war Europe and post-war England. And Rabbi Carmel was the editor and redactor of all of the volumes of Michtav Me'Eliyahu. And he wrote his own books, he was quite prolific himself, and he writes in source number 9, a word on kfira. What is heresy? What is heresy? And he writes as follows: it is unfortunately a common practice for a Talmud Chacham to accuse a colleague of heresy if he puts forward a view which the first gentleman considers unacceptable for Orthodox Jews. Although he thinks he is defending the purity of the faith, it is much more likely that the first gentleman is transgressing the biblical prohibition of publishing libels against his neighbor. Rav Yosef Alba wrote a famous book on the principles of Judaism. He warns people to be sparing with the epithet heretic. A heretic, he says, is one who knows the truth but deliberately sets out to deny it and denigrate it. On the other hand, and he quotes, one who has no intention of rebelling against the Torah or of turning away from the true path or of attacking our tradition, but his purpose is to explain the verses according to his own ideas. Even if his ideas may be wrong, He is neither a sectarian nor a heretic, God forbid. I have seen people of insignificant learning but wise in their own eyes, who speak unduly against truly great people. It is therefore permitted to any wise person to investigate the principles of our religion and to explain the verses in accord with the truth as he sees it. Now, of course, Rabbi Carmel qualifies this. He says, we have spoken, and of course, when you say the truth as he sees it, you have to know exactly what it means as he sees it. There are certain parameters in biblical and free biblical interpretation also, and one has to know those parameters. So he says, we have spoken a good deal about compulsion. We refer, of course, not to compulsion from outside factors, but inner compulsion. One should be compelled only by the truth as one sees it. This does not mean that carte blanche is given to anyone to formulate his own ideas on these important and sensitive issues. When Rav Albo made this statement, he was careful to add one word. It is permitted to any wise person. Wise in this context means knowledgeable in all aspects of the problem. In science issues, for example, the only person qualified to judge is one who, besides being fully conversant with the Torah aspects of the matter, is also fully informed concerning the scientific aspects. It is only he who can judge whether the facts are compelling or not. And so, when you hear of very learned rabbis debunking certain scientific theories, and you see a superficial or cursory knowledge of the science, then you're not impressed. And it almost weakens the greatness of the Torah scholar by his trying to extend himself into an area that he really is not an expert in. And so I certainly won't be doing that. And that's why, as you've noticed over these past 4 weeks, this is the 4th week, I am not trying to present any deep analysis of scientific theory or fact in any area of science, but rather just to demonstrate some of the philosophy of science and to see where there are intersections between Torah and science. But let's go back. And so if people shy away from this topic, it should not be because of a fear of some kind of witch hunt, of them getting labeled as a heretic or a follower of some sectarian movement. And I think it's very, very important, especially in the world in which we live, where there's a lot of craziness going around, that we not allow ourselves to capitulate to that kind of witch hunt mentality. In any event, let's just see the facts as they are. The Gemara in Pesachim says as follows, and this will be we're dealing with the first question that we asked, which is it possible that the rabbis may have had limited knowledge based upon the science of their time? The question that the Gemara in Pesachim asks, where does the sun go in the nighttime? What happens to the sun? It disappears. The sages of Israel say, in the daytime the sun goes under the firmament, and in the nighttime above the firmament. Now it's important to understand what our sages mean by the firmament. We have this concept of a firmament even discussed in the Torah. So what does it mean? The ancient and medieval conception of a firmament was that our world is surrounded by a sphere, and this sphere orbits our planet. And the reason why the sky is blue is because the inside of the sphere, like a huge beach ball that surrounds our planet, has a blue color to it. At night, there's no light source that's inside this big beach ball that surrounds our planet, because the sun is no longer inside the beach ball. Where did the sun go? The rabbis of Israel said that this sphere has a bottom to it, which is open at the bottom, because the Earth is only the part of the hemisphere that we can see from horizon to horizon. It's covered by some kind of spherical or dome cover, and there's a bottom to it so that the sphere doesn't completely close beneath us, beneath the Earth, and that allows an area for the sun to escape. When the sun sets in the east at night, it goes under the width of the dome and then comes outside the dome and travels now from east to west above the dome, on the outside of the dome. That's the kippah that the Talmud is talking about. And therefore it travels during the day from east to west. Sets in the west, and then comes out of the dome, goes back up in the sky, travels now from west to east above the dome, so that by morning time it's in position again to come underneath the dome and to rise again underneath the dome and illuminate the entire dome. So that's what Chazal are depicting as far as what happens to the sun. Let's be very clear. This is just the superficial statement of our sages. But it gets more interesting. The sages of the nations say, which means that if we consult the wise men of other cultures, of other nations, they will tell us something else happens to the sun at night. In the day, the sun goes below the firmament, and in the night, under the earth. So according to the other sages of the other nations, when the sun sets in the west at night, it doesn't go back up above the dome, but rather goes, if this is our earth, this is our planet Earth. We don't know whether the rabbis are cognizant of the fact that the earth is spherical. For all we know, they may believe that the earth is flat. The sun goes beneath this Torah, this earth that we live on, and it travels underneath, so that by the time the morning comes, it's ready in position to come into the dome once again after having gone underneath the earth. That's the opinion of the sages of the other nations. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said, their words are preferable to ours, because in the daytime springs are cold, while in the night springs are hot. Now let's understand what his argument is. He says the theory of the wise men of other nations makes more sense to me than the theory of the rabbis. Because the proof that the sun goes underneath our earth is that over the course of the night, water that is in well springs and in wells gets warmer. It must have a heat source to heat up that water. The heat source must be the sun that travels beneath the earth and heats up any water that is underground. And that's how I know, says Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, that the rabbis are not correct and that the sages of the other nations are correct. That's the face value of this Gemara. Now when you think about it, you learn a number of things. From a scientific point of view, both the rabbis and the wise men of the other nations are making a big mistake. The rabbis are clearly wrong because there's no dome over our planet that is opaque and blocks the sunlight as it travels over the dome at nighttime. That certainly is not true. But the wise men of the other nations may be a little bit closer to the truth, but they're also completely wrong, because even though it may be said that yes, based on our knowledge of astronomy today, we know that the earth is in a rotation, and therefore the sun goes around the earth, or the earth goes around the sun. But it's true that when we go to sleep at night, tonight, the sun is positioned on another part on the other side of the earth. It is bright and sunny, so that there is truth to that statement. But what is their proof? Their proof is that spring water heats up at night because the sun is heating it underneath where we are living. Now that clearly doesn't make any sense. That also scientifically is not true. First of all, water doesn't really become warmer at night. It seems that way because the temperature is cooler at night in the outside, and so the wells insulate the water's temperature that had become warmed during the day, and so it has, by contrast, the feeling that it's warmer, but it's really not. But beyond that, any geothermal energy that heats water in well springs is not a result of the sun shining in China and then causing my well to become warmer. The distance from China to my well is too far, and there's too much stuff in between for my well to become warm because the sun is shining in China. Okay, so we understand that we read this and we say, how quaint, this sounds just absurd. Both opinions sound to be completely false. So the question is, what do we do with this? The first thing we have to realize is something that we had seen from the Vilna Gaon a couple of weeks ago when he was criticizing the Rambam. When the Vilna Gaon was criticizing the Rambam for not believing in demonic forces, even though the sages discussed them quite comprehensively, the Vilna Gaon said the only reason why the Rambam denied the existence of these beings is because he truly doesn't understand the mystical realm, and that even when there are passages of the Talmud that you don't understand, you have to read them on a deeper level. And that deeper level is not always the face value. And so one way that we could easily explain this Gemara is Chazal and their counterparts, the other nations of the world, are not even attempting to describe scientific reality. They're not even attempting to describe scientific fact. What are they doing? They're having some kind of esoteric, mystical discussion about another plane of reality that has nothing to do with the actual sun in the sky. And this is a discussion on a metaphorical level, which has deeper implications to a mystical realm, a metaphysical realm. And that may be one way for us to accept this without having to challenge that the rabbis don't know what they're talking about from a scientific point of view. Let's take a look at another halacha, however, that's brought in the Gemara that is going to be more difficult to address. Yes.
Even within the Pesachim Psukim you read, some of the sages say that the other sages, the non-Jewish sages, their opinions are preferred.
Yes, exactly.
So it almost demonstrates that it's okay to accept scientific knowledge.
It's an excellent point. I'm so glad that you raised that point. And thank you, because you reminded me of what I wanted to say. What you also see from this Gemara is that Rabbi has no hesitation to acknowledge that we made a mistake. That if we can be shown, if it can be demonstrated to us, that scientifically we can empirically demonstrate that the sun goes underneath the earth instead of going over the dome at night, we would accept it. So that's actually a very important point, is that it is the humility of Rebbe to say that it's okay for us to be wrong about things that really seem to have no ramification to Judaism whatsoever. Torah is always going to be Torah whether the sun goes above the dome or goes underneath the earth. And so it's okay for us to correct our positions on areas of science which are not going to going to impinge upon Torah Judaism, upon our practice and worship of God. Okay, now let's go on to another piece of Gemara. This is Gemara in Maseches Shabbos Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Beis, and I've only chosen these two Gemaras, even though there's really a whole bunch of Gemaras that are like these. These are two prime examples, but there are many, many more, which we'll hopefully see shortly. Rabbi Eliezer says one who kills a louse on Shabbos is like one who kills a camel on Shabbos. Now Rabbi Eliezer is stating the following thing. If you kill a bug on Shabbos, it's no different from killing an animal on Shabbos. And just like there's a violation of Shabbos if you kill a camel, there's also a violation of Shabbos if you step on a bug. Okay, quite simply. And that's why we know, your kids say, kill it. And then you say, no, it's Shabbos, we can't kill it on Shabbos, right? So we all know this halacha. However, the Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Eliezer in the case of lice. They agree with him in all other insects and creatures, but with lice they disagree, because lice do not reproduce, and therefore one is not liable for killing them on Shabbos. The Torah only holds you liable for killing a creature that was born from parents. But if the creature was spontaneously generated from perspiration or dirt, then that is not considered to be a creature for which you're liable for killing on Shabbos. So, surprisingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch rules that it is permitted to kill a louse on Shabbos, since we follow the position of the Rabbanan, of the Chachamim, and not the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, this is one of those few examples, and we'll see a couple more later when we study Rabbi Carmel's essay. This is one of those few cases where Jewish law is directly impacted by bad science. Now, the truth of the matter is that it wasn't until the advent of the telescope and other technologies sometime at the beginning of the modern era, that scientists actually discovered that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation. There was a belief that flies spontaneously form around stagnant pools of water, or mosquitoes. There was a theory that maggots spontaneously are generated from rotting food. And there was a belief that lice are spontaneously generated from human perspiration. This was observed, and based upon people's best guesses of what's going on in the world of nature, this is what people believed. And as a result, the rabbi said this does not count as a real life for which you would be liable for taking on Shabbos. The Shulchan Aruch paskins this way. So the halachic issue now becomes, is it permitted or is it not permitted to kill a louse on Shabbos? So, if we look in the Shulchan Aruch has not changed since the 16th century. And this is perhaps a discussion for the next step. But I want to first take a look at the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim. The Rambam is talking about astronomical measurements of the various different heavenly bodies in the sky that we see. And the Rambam engages in a discussion of defending the rabbi's statement that the astronomical bodies are actually quite far away from us, because he had heard that some people were critical of a statement in the Talmud, a statement in the Gemara, where the rabbis talk about these outlandish distances from one star to the next, from one celestial sphere to the next. So the Rambam writes, I frequently hear from those who know something about astronomy, this is from Moreh Nevuchim, the third section, essay 14, that our sages exaggerated the distances of the heavenly bodies when they said that the thickness of each sphere is 500 years' journey. And then he goes through the math, and he tells you that actually that depiction of the heavenly bodies being a 500-year journey from one heavenly body or one heavenly sphere to the next is actually quite accurate. And by the time you get to the seventh sphere, that is the Saturn sphere, you've already traveled hundreds and hundreds of years of journey. Okay. So then he says in the following statement, he says, and this is where I've underlined it for you, you must, however, now this is despite the fact that he's just defended the scientific statement of the sages about astronomical bodies. But then he says as follows, you must, however, not expect that everything our sages say respecting astronomical matters should agree with observation. For mathematics were not fully developed in those days, and their statements were not based on the authority of the prophets, but on the knowledge which they either themselves possessed or derived from contemporary men of science. But I will not on that account denounce what they say correctly in accordance with real fact as untrue or accidentally true. In other words, the Rambam is saying, despite the fact that I'm not here to tell you that everything that Chazal say is scientifically accurate, but here they got it right. And when they got it right, we have to demonstrate that they knew what they were talking about. But there may be other instances when you open up a Gemara, you read a Midrash, and they won't be reconcilable with what modern science tells us. Don't be bothered by that, because the rabbis were not basing their pronouncements in scientific issues on what they received from the prophets, but rather were basing their statements on what they knew to be the science of their day. If anyone has a different way of reading the Rambam, please tell me, but it seems to be as clear as day as that which is what the Rambam is saying. And that's how people have understood the Rambam for centuries. Chazal's purview was limited to areas of Torah knowledge and did not extend to certain areas of science. Now that doesn't mean that they didn't know anything about science. As we've learned from a previous discussion, Shmuel was cited as being someone who was such an expert on the motion of the celestial bodies that he said that I know the motion of the bodies as well. I can see a road map in the sky as clearly as I know the streets and alleyways of the city of Nahardar. Or whether it was Pumbedisa, I don't remember anymore. Was it Nahardar or Pumbedisa? It was one of those two. But the point is that he said, I have a clear knowledge. There may have been rabbis who were clearly experts on these matters, but there could also have been rabbis who were not experts, but were basing their pronouncements, whether it was a midrashic statement or a Talmudic statement, based on the science of their time. And that's not an indictment, not at all an indictment. It shouldn't shake someone's faith. They were only expected to have knowledge of things that have pertained to the practice of Judaism. Rav Hirsch, and I thank Rabbi Nassan Slifkin for having published this letter. It's called Trusting the Torah Sages, written in 1876. And it was published in 1976 in the Jerusalem journal Hamaya. And he writes, Rav Hirsch writes as follows to the person asking him the question. In my opinion, the first principle that every student of Chazal statements must keep before his eyes is the following. Chazal were the sages of God's law, the receivers, transmitters, and teachers of his Torahs, his mitzvos, and his interpersonal laws. They did not especially master the natural sciences, geometry, astronomy, or medicine, except insofar as they needed them for knowing, observing, and fulfilling the Torah. We do not find that this knowledge was transmitted to them from Sinai. It's a pretty bold statement. We do find that Chazal themselves considered the wisdom of the Gentile scholars equal to their own in the natural sciences. Where does Rav Hirsch know this? From our discussion of the Gemara in Pesachim about where the sun goes at night. To determine who was right in areas where the Gentile sages disagreed with their own knowledge, they did not rely on their tradition, but on reason. Moreover, they even respected the opinion of the Gentile scholars, admitting when the opinion of the latter seemed more correct than their own. Here, Rav Hirsch is citing the statement made by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi that it seems that the wise men of the other nations are more correct than we. Okay. Now, if this were the end of the story, this would be the end of the story. But this is not the end of the story. What I mean by that is that the Rambam and Rav Hirsch present the rational opinion. They present the statement that says that, as we would expect, there may be things in the Gemara that are not scientifically accurate, and that's not an indictment of Chazal. They were limited by the era in which they lived. But there are others who strongly disagree. And therefore, if you take a look at the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlis, one of the composers of the Shulchan Aruch,
Sorry, before you go on, is he saying that they didn't master the science of their day, or that they did not get a Masorah on science, which at any point in time it is to be verified is going to be correct or not? Seems to be a difference.
Well, he's saying that, number one, they didn't have a Masorah of science. They didn't receive that knowledge from their forebears. And number two, that was not a discipline on which they focused. They were not expected to go to, the MIT to study physics and to study cosmology. Those were not the disciplines that they were expected to master. They mastered scholarship in Torah, and to whatever extent they needed to know about the natural sciences in order to practice Judaism on either an individual or communal level, those are the areas of science that they studied. But things that did not affect the practice of Torah, they simply did not focus their attentions upon. So Rav Hirsch, I believe, is saying both. Let me just, I know our time is limited. I will save I'm just going to go another 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll take questions. The Ramah is very strong. He says, I hereby state that all the words of Chazal are based on true wisdom, and there is nothing twisted or perverse in their words. This is true even though sometimes it appears at first glance that their words do not agree with wise men who base their statements on empirical data, especially in the area of science. Some rabbis wish to justify their suggestion that Chazal's knowledge of science was limited on the fact that they themselves stated that the wise men of the other nations bettered the wise men of Israel regarding the question of where the sun goes at night. As we just saw Rav Hirsch do. Rav Hirsch lives many centuries after the Ramah. Maimonides also wrote that scientific knowledge was not complete in the times of the prophets and earlier sages. But a reader can only tremble upon the suggestion that Chazal did not know science. One who truly cares about the honor of his Creator and the honor of the sages of the Torah should never think such things, but should rather pore carefully over their words. Certainly we will find within their words, as we have explained accordingly in this essay, because the Ramah's whole essay, in this particular book that he's writing, in this particular chapter of the book that he's writing, he's trying to explain certain pronouncements of Chazal having to do with astronomy that at face value seem false, but then he says, but when you do a deeper analysis of their statements, they actually are shown to be accurate based on the science of his day. That they did actually know of all of the sciences of the Gentiles. They knew even more areas of knowledge, things that are hidden from all the wise men of the other nations. They knew even more stuff. Not less stuff, they knew more stuff. The Ramah is not alone. There are many other Rishonim and Achronim who follow this tradition, that it is incorrect to suggest that Chazal were limited in their knowledge of science. So you see a genuine machlokes l'shem shamayim. However, one has to be aware that one who subscribes to the Rambam, God forbid such a person, we can never call such a person a heretic. We can never call a person who subscribes to the Rambam and Rav Hirsch a heretic. You may disagree with their worldview. You may think that they're being overly rationalist in their approach to Yiddishkeit and their approach to the sages. Because after all, the sages knew all areas of mysticism. If they were able to peer into, beyond the veil of reality and see God's world, then how could they not know the basics of a solar system? So that's certainly an appropriate perspective. But there's an equally cogent perspective to the other side, which is they were so immersed in their mystical and halachic experience of Judaism that they didn't deem it important to peer into the physical universe, which is really only a facade of true reality. So what's the big deal? Okay, Stan.
The Gemara, Rosh Hashanah, it seemed very clear that they understood the whole solar system very well. And there's all discussions of revolving around the sun and so on.
I'm not sure which Gemara you're referring to.
Rosh Hashanah, there's lots of discussions about the planets and so on.
There's a discussion about the moon. Rabbi Gamliel had a chart on his wall of the different stages of the moon, waxing and waning, but I don't know that you see that. You'll have to show me the Gemara that you're referring to. Okay.
Can you call someone who subscribes to the Vilna Gaon's Shita a heretic?
The whose Shita?
The Vilna Gaon. Wasn't he was reputed to have said anyone, to the extent anyone is deficient in math and science, is also deficient to that extent in Torah. And I'm just wondering whether or not he would hold differently than what the Rambam does in terms of science.
He would hold differently. A couple of weeks ago, we demonstrated that the Vilna Gaon was very critical of the Rambam for limiting himself to science. So he may have applauded the Rambam's exploration of the scientific and natural world, but he felt that the Rambam was overly rationalist in limiting himself and not allowing himself to accept the deeper mystical realm of the sages as well. Yes, Sammy.
Going back to note 3, the Rambam writes this in the Mora, which is a philosophy work. I'm wondering, with the issue, if you based halacha based on bad science, I wonder if some would argue that the Rambam may not hold that because the source is not in his halachic work, Mishnah Torah, where it's in the more philosophical work. So I'm wondering, because where it shows up, does that make a difference? Like the Rambam?
Well, that's a very good question. The question is the Rambam of the Mora the same Rambam of the Mishnah Torah? Is it?
No, actually, even if he's the same Rambam, he reserves the Mora for philosophical issues, and he's not codifying it in halachic.
Yeah. But of what halachic ramification is it?
Killing the lice, let's say, in Shabbos.
Okay.
So he would probably, some may argue, he would stay like the Shulchan Aruch because he never doesn't show up anywhere.
Very, very possible. Very possible that he would subscribe to the Shulchan Aruch if it was demonstrated to the Rambam that in a microscope that lice are born from parents, from eggs, and not spontaneously generated. It's very possible that he would say that the law stays the same.
He wouldn't be as liberal. Maybe.
And we have to, by the way, we have to discover how that can be. How can that be that the great rationalist, the Rambam himself, would also say that the law is immutable regardless of whether the scientific knowledge has brought us to a different state of understanding. That's what, we won't have time to do that tonight. We'll do that in Mirza Hashem next week. Yes?
I believe the halacha said that if a girl is defiled before the age of 2, she's still considered a ketubah.
I think it's 3.
3.
Yeah.
Is that because of an observable scientific phenomenon, or is it an arbitrary date? Do they actually say that it grows back? Here's a calendar date before which it happens?
Well, that's a good question. Did the sages base their knowledge of human anatomy on observation? There are times when the Gemara says they did. The Gemara says that the rabbis themselves didn't do this, but they were ancient doctors and scientists who did forensic studies. They were actually very cruel people who were engaged in the study of medicine, who would get, the Gemara talks about Cleopatra, who studied fetuses at different stages of gestation in order to determine that after 40 days from conception, the limbs of a fetus start to become noticeable, that you can see the formation of the limbs. How did she discover this? She got a whole bunch of her maidservants, got them impregnated, and then had them killed at different stages of pregnancy. I mean, that's how, thank God, scientific discovery is more ethical, medical discovery is more ethical today than it was back in the ancient world. So did Chazal know this as a tradition, or did they know this from what medical knowledge of the time told them? We have no way of knowing. That's all part of the. It's all part of the same question. Okay. Anything else?
Just want to ask a question. Just a question of information. I just heard the gentleman now say that in the Mishnah Torah, in the Sefer Madat, I think it is. There's a lot of repetition of what's in more in the book the little that I've heard.
Well, there's definitely overlap. There's definitely intersection between the two.
So the fact that the fact that he's going over here and it's not as much over here, I think that really proves it.
Correct. I mean, I think that the Rambam subscribed to everything that, when he wrote the Moreh Nevuchim towards the end of his life, he still subscribed to everything that he wrote in the Mishnah Torah. Didn't mean to erase anything. He was addressing a different, perhaps a slightly different audience, since we know in his introduction that he was writing this as an appeal to people who were philosophically inclined and could not find a way to reconcile Torah and philosophy, which we explain is also Torah and science. And that's why he wrote things in a very rational form. Whether he himself would have subscribed to everything that he wrote in the Moreh as his absolute worldview is anyone's guess, because he may have been writing some of the things polemically. There's a lot of speculation on what the Rambam himself believed, especially when you look at some comparisons and contrasts between some of the things he writes in the Moreh Nevuchim and some of the things he writes in other of his texts. Okay. There are two other texts that I think are very important to see. One is Rabbi Yitzchak Lompranti from Pachad Yitzchak, who says that nowadays it should be usher to kill lice. And then the text from Rabbi Aryeh Carmel, who wrote this footnote in the Michtav Me'Eliyahu itself to try and explain how the sages, even when being wrong, were right.
Isn't there a law that the majority...
Well, when it came to halachic matters, you side with the majority, but Rav Dessler felt that even when Chazal were basing their statements on bad science, their halachic pronouncements were not based exclusively on bad science, but were based on Masoretic principles. So if they said that you're allowed to kill a louse on Shabbos, it's not based exclusively on the fact that lice are spontaneously generated. It's based on Masorah. It's based on a tradition that they had going back from generations to the times of the prophets that permits killing lice on Shabbos. And the same strategy will be used to explain other things as well. I'm a little bit conflicted whether to continue this discussion 2 weeks hence or to go to the next topic, which is to discuss a little bit about physics and the atom and the miracle of God's world in the micro verse instead of the macro verse. So I'll think about it, but if you want, you can hold on to these sheets and we will continue in 2 weeks from tonight.